Well, I don't have a good answer for you for how the Europeans came together because no one, even in Europe, anticipated this level of support. And everyone is taking any weapon system that they can that doesn't require a static footprint, so no jets because that requires an airport or an airfield. But anything that can be carried or moved by truck that is not nailed down is being shipped in. And the reason originally was they wanted to give the Ukrainians a fighting chance. But I think it was the convoy that was north of Kiev, the 40-mile long one, that terrified Western leaders. Because we had this 40-mile convoy with thousands of vehicles that stalled out in a day because of lack of fuel, just horrible logistics. And then 2 days later, they ran out of food. And so all the soldiers had to get out and walk back to Belarus, just leaving their vehicles behind. Well, from a certain point of view, that's yay, the Russians are incompetent. But until you realize that if there ever was a direct conflict between Western and especially American forces and Russian forces on the battlefield, the Russians would be obliterated. That's a bad thing because it means that if Russia pushes through and captures all of Ukraine and then moves to its next stages, which are those gaps in Romania and Poland, for example, there will be a direct fight, and the Russians would be obliterated. And they would then face a simple choice. Do we go into a humiliating strategic withdrawal from which this country will never recover? Or do we up the ante to include nukes? And so once that issue kind of sank in the White House and DOD, now we are almost desperate to send any possible weapons systems that we can. So in April, this war is going to be incredibly bloody because when the war started, the Ukrainians only had a few hundred Javelin anti-tank launchers, and they only had a few dozen Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Well, that was before the Americans started supplying things in bulk. They're only now starting to arrive. So we're talking about the Russians suffering tank and air attrition at an order of magnitude higher than they are right now. And this has gone from an issue, well, we need to slow the Russians and extract a cost, but we know we can't win, to if we don't win, we are really risking a nuclear conflict. So we have to do everything we can short of regular direct intervention to crush the entire Russian system as quickly as possible. So Ukraine is now the field upon which this will all be determined. Okay, so first, the splash that's in the news. Second, the stuff that's behind it that's actually more important. And then the third, what's coming. So the splash that's in the news is going after the oligarchs. In the 1990s, a group of people took advantage of the collapse of the Soviet system and grabbed assets for themselves on any number of means. Very little of it was what we would consider illegal, or what the Russian law would consider illegal, because there wasn't a lot of Russian law then, but it was definitely unethical. And they have now become multi-billionaires. This first batch of oligarchs, when Putin came in the year 2000, he brought them to heel. He made them a deal that if they stayed completely out of politics, he would not go after their assets. And so there's been this truce between them for the last 20 years. Under Putin, he elevated a number of people from his FSB days, KGB days, based on who's doing the math, to take over large portions of the Russian economy. And this includes things like the defense industry, Gazprom, which is the world's largest natural gas company, and Rosneft, which is the world's second largest oil company. And these are all people who were not part of that original group. These are people who are all in Putin's inner circle. So we're going after two different groups of oligarchs here. The ones that are around Putin, totally worth it. These are people who have been with Putin, bolted to the hip with every single policy he's done for 20 years. These people should be brought down. The other people, the folks that have been there since the 1990s, I don't mean to suggest that they're kinder, gentler folks. I mean, they are robber barons at best. But going after them just makes you feel good because they have very little influence over Putin. So we're talking here about melon scooping the entire core out of the Russian economy by going after the leadership, but one group is not going to affect the war whatsoever. And that's that first group in the 90s. They're the ones who have most of their assets overseas. So they're the ones who are actually vulnerable to what's going on. Now, behind that, we didn't just sanction a bunch of companies and people. We sanctioned the Russian central bank. And we don't think of how important a central bank is in systems because we always assume it's a neutral actor in the background that maybe messes around with interest rates and bond purchases, and that's about it. But they are the primary connectivity point between any economy and the rest of the world. One of the thousands reasons that I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin is it assumes that the central banks, A, will empower it, and B, will do nothing to impede it. And that's clearly not true. And in the case of the Russian central bank, they can no longer deal with any entity in any of these countries and access any currencies that are dollars, euros, yen, won, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, Taiwanese dollars, and I'm sure I've met Swiss francs, and I'm sure I've left out a bunch. So anything that the bank tries to do anywhere cannot use any of those normal channels. And so among other things, that denied the Russians access to some 90% of their currency reserves. That means that when they sell oil, somebody has to physically do a transfer in a third party and fly the money into Moscow. This is not a tenable situation. We tried doing some version of this for Iran and it was crushing, but we've never done it to an economy this big or this holistically. And then what's coming? We have a number of sanctions against Russia. It's the most sanctioned country in history now. Actually, it has more sanctions on it than all other countries in all other time frames throughout human history. The Europeans are now talking about an open ban on all sales of Russian crude, not just to the Europeans themselves, because all that would do is shift the pain. They're talking at the beginning of the process of talking about making sure that Russian crude can't make it to market anymore. That would mean, among other things, blocking ships from going in and out of the Baltic Sea, probably at the Skagerrak, and probably blocking ships going in and out of the Black Sea, probably through the Turkish Straits. Now, how the Russians would respond to that would be really interesting, but if the blockades are further back from Russian ports, the Russians militarily can't do anything about it. So we're looking here at removing 4 to 5 million barrels a day of crude production from the world. That is more than enough to guarantee an energy-induced depression that is global in scale. And the crazy thing is, we might even get there without an official sanction, because insurance companies are not allowing ships to go into these ports. The ports are shallow, so they can't take super tankers and then run it to China. So either you get this daisy chain of dozens of mid-sized vessels that are going to be loading onto a super tanker in sight of a NATO port and expecting that NATO is not going to do anything about it, or they just close the strait altogether. One way or another, we are headed for a very interesting year. Let me put it to you from the point of view of an outsider. So here we've got the United States, who has been moving down a path towards isolationism for 30 years, and it just wakes up one day, decides that it wants to get involved in the Ukrainian-Russian situation. It's been removing troops from the Middle East. It's been removing troops from Asia. It's been removing troops from Europe. When Biden was elected, we were at the low point for international involvement since Reconstruction. We had fewer troops stationed abroad than since Reconstruction. So, we're at a 150-year low right now. And now we're telling people that they can't use the dollar or any currency. Everyone who thought that the American retreat was going to give rise to a multipolar world in which the United States had minimal power really hadn't been paying attention to how the world works. To have a global currency, the first thing you have to be sure of is that the country that issues the currency has to really not care about what happens with it every single day. Because if they're going to manipulate the currency in order to achieve trade advantages, then nobody's going to want it. And in addition, it has to be, sufficiently deep pool of liquidity in order to work. There's only one country that fits that criteria. There's only one country that's fit that criteria since 1945, and it's certainly not China. And people are discovering now, countries are discovering now, that if you want to be part of that system, there are certain things you can and cannot do. Invading countries that, for whatever reason, the United States should not be invaded makes the list. And so I would say that the biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that it can dominate all of East Asia and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, That's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything along the lines that they thought they could.
It's basically, I have to remain in good standing with the issuer of the global reserve currency, or else I could be next, right?
Exactly.
I could be the one
and there's nowhere else to go. I mean, the yuan is only traded internally because it's the most manipulated currency in history. The euro confiscates bank deposits to pay for bailouts. I mean, are there things that the Fed could do better, in my opinion? Of course. But compared to all the competition, I mean, there isn't any competition.